In this series, we're answering the question, what is the gospel? We said that the gospel is the good news story of God and creation. A story by God about how God is light, life, and love. And a story that invites us to partner with God as He makes a way for creation to come back to life in His very goodness. So let's get back to the story. Wait, where were we again? Oh, right. We started by hearing the story of how God created the world. And from that story, we learned the truth that very goodness comes from God. We also learned that when humanity lives in the light of this truth, we can live the lives of self-sacrifice, forgiveness, and rest we were made for. Next, we heard the story of how humanity lost sight of the truth, when a serpent tricked humanity into believing a big lie, the lie that humanity has to make their own very goodness. We saw how when humans try to make their own very goodness, we are self-serving and unforgiving and endlessly striving for a very good life we can never make for ourselves. And we called that mode of living sin. So next, we heard how God made a plan to inspire humans to trust Him again. God's plan was to partner with the human family called Israel, to bless the world by sharing God's very goodness. We learned that this partnership deal, the covenant, was made possible by God's unique forever and no matter what love, a love where God covers both sides of the deal. In our last video, we saw God's forever and no matter what love in action when He delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt and then spent 40 years healing Israel's hearts from their time in Egypt to prepare them for their mission to bless the world. We said that if Israel was going to be successful at sharing God's very goodness with the world, they were going to need to remember to rely on God for very goodness, remember God's covenant promise to them, and to stay upside down. So now you're totally wondering, how did it go? Overall, not great. For the next few centuries, Israel slowly forgot the lessons of the desert. And in this episode, you'll hear how Israel forgot to live upside down, broke their relational deal, and ultimately totally forgot to rely on God's very goodness. But you'll also hear how God, who is the source of very goodness and whose loving commitment is forever and no matter what, remained faithful to His people through it all. This part of the story starts in the book of Joshua. And honestly, things went okay for a while. Israel entered the promised land by crossing the Jordan River. God made the way by stopping the water of the river so that Israel could pass through. In other words, God's people passed through the water into new life. Where have I heard that before? Anyway, Israel starts off this new life at a good location with good leadership and trusting in God for very goodness. And the story of how God's people entered the city of Jericho is the perfect example. God told Moses' protege Joshua that if Israel marched around the city of Jericho for 6 days, and then marched around the city 7 times on the 7th day, and then blew a horn and then shouted, that the walls of the city that they were taking over would just fall down. It was like a perfect test of what they had learned in the wilderness. Would they do the strange upside down thing? Would they believe in God forever and no matter what? Would they rely on God for very goodness? The answer was yes. Israel obeyed and the walls came down. But pretty much as soon as Israel came into contact with the world, they started believing the lie that they had to make their own very goodness in it. Like all of humanity before them, Israel entered the cycle of sin that follows making your own very goodness. But the difference between Israel and the rest of humanity was that they had a God they could turn back to. So during this time, there was a lot of sin in Israel. But there was also a lot of God showing up in faithfulness to bring them back into His very goodness. But this cycle of God cleaning up after Israel couldn't go on forever, and it definitely wasn't God's plan. We said that if Israel was going to hold up their side of the deal, that they would need to rely on God for very goodness and remember God's covenant promise to them and live in a way that was upside down from the rest of the world. Over time, it became impossible for Israel to do their job because one by one, they abandoned these lessons of the desert. First, Israel got sick of being upside down. You see, every nation around them had a king to theoretically go out and make very goodness for his people. Israel didn't want to be the strange upside down people anymore without a king. So they insisted that they wanted a king for themselves. And so God sent them a king. And not just any king, a really kingy king. The kind of normal king Israel expected. A king who was like kind of hot and powerful and unfortunately all about himself. A king named Saul. And Israel learned pretty quickly that this kind of king was not the source of very goodness. And so instead, God raised up another king that was more his style. A kid, a seventh son, a shepherd boy named David. When David was king, he was not perfect, but he was all about relying on God and about giving God credit for being the source of very goodness. And so his reign is kind of considered the glory days of Israel. But something still wasn't quite right, because David was still a human being, and therefore still susceptible to the lie that he had to make very goodness. And so this is how things fell apart. David decided that he was the one who was going to make very goodness for God on earth by building God a temple. But when David checked in with God about this plan, because that's the kind of dude David was, God said no. And even though David was bummed, he trusted God. Unfortunately, in the next generation, David's son Solomon did build the temple. He decided he was going to be the one to make very goodness for God on earth. But what happens when we act like we're the source of very goodness? Oh, right, sin. And so it's not surprising that when Solomon built the temple for God and also adorned a palace for himself and also made Israel a huge superpower, he did it by oppressing his people. Israel didn't want to be upside down. They wanted to be like everyone else. They wanted a king to make very goodness for them. So God sent them a king, and Israel got exactly what kings always give. And this is where things get totally out of control. First, Solomon's son Rehoboam decided to definitively not rely on God for very goodness. When the people came to him and asked him to be different from his dad, to stop oppressing them and basically lay off and let them rest, at that moment, Rehoboam had a chance to turn back and trust in God for very goodness. Instead, he decided to double down, literally, on his dad's oppression of the people. And that decision had real consequences. Because one of his dad's officials, Jeroboam, sees that Rehoboam's decision does not go over well. And so Jeroboam decides to capitalize on his mistake to try to make some very goodness for himself. He starts a rebellion, and Israel splits in two, with Rehoboam as the king over Judah in the south and Jeroboam as the king of Israel in the north, which, to be clear, is not God's plan for Israel. And from here, as you can imagine, things do not go well, because now we have two kingdoms living the lie, trying to make their own very goodness, oppressing the poor and the foreigners and ignoring the widows and the orphans, not remembering what it was like to be a slave in Egypt. Forget passing the cake. They're scrounging around the host's house looking for ingredients they can steal to make their own cake by any means necessary. Plus, they're definitely not keeping up with their side of the relational deal with God. At this point, they're worshiping gods, idols, even kings. Basically, anything that claims to be the source of very goodness, they're grasping for it and giving it a taste, like Eve in the garden. So how does the forever and no matter what God respond when his people seem to have forgotten the plan? He warns them a lot and for a long time. He sends prophets, people who speak for God, to remind his people that very goodness comes from God, to warn them that trying to make your own very goodness will not end well, and to give them hope that there is a God that loves them forever and no matter what. The prophets call on Israel to turn back to God today, but also these prophets are starting to talk about how God is going to cover both sides of the deal. They proclaim that a Savior is coming who will save humanity once and for all from the lie. The judgment against Israel is real, but so is the hope. And sometimes the prophets' messages actually work. Sometimes the kings and their people hear the warning and turn back to God's very goodness. But no matter what, about a generation later, God's people eventually get sucked back into believing the lie. And there came a point where, just like with Pharaoh in Egypt, it became clear that God's people were completely done trusting in him as the source of very goodness. So what does the forever and no matter what God do when his people have become the lie they were chosen to expose? He draws them back by letting them go. He withdraws his protection and allows them to experience the consequences of trying to make their own very goodness. He shows them that the gods they're worshiping can't really help them, and that their methods of securing goodness will always end in death. Israel is conquered and spends 70 years at least in exile in Assyria and Babylon. This was an unquestionably dark time in the history of God's people, but even in exile, the light flickered as some people, like a guy named Daniel and his friends, remembered the truth of God's promises and trusted in them. Eventually, God's people returned to their land, but not everyone made it back. And well, that's a bit of an understatement. But those who did make it back to the land, the remnant, were changed by their experience in exile. They understood in a new way the importance of relying on God for very goodness. They also really knew from experience that they couldn't escape the cycle of sin on their own. Israel was ready to commit to a new kind of life. And so they held fast to God's promise made in blood to Abraham to cover both sides of the deal. God's promise of forever and no matter what love, and especially God's promise through the prophets that God was about to send a savior. For the second time, Israel waited 400 years for God's very good rescue.